Today we're going to be looking at swing percentages and tuplets. If you don't know what a swing percentage is, I promise you'll know by the end of this video. Same thing with tuplets. You'll be so confident that you can explain it to somebody else. In order to understand swing percentages, the first thing we need to know is, what is swing? By definition, swing is when a pulse is divided unequally. We'll say for the sake of argument, swing is a form of rhythmic displacement. In order to understand rhythmic displacement, we have to understand what rhythm is. We also have to understand what displacement is. This is an oversimplification. We'll say that rhythm has to do with timing and delivery, how you deliver those notes in time. If we think of a quick example like the melody to Star Wars, for instance, we have da 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 da. I delivered that melody in the prescribed rhythm to the theme, right? Like that sounds like it's from the Star Wars theme. But listen to how different that melody feels if I say it with a different rhythmic delivery. Ba bup ba 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 bup bup ba 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 bup 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 bup. We just added like way more rests. We made the notes like way shorter, but still it's the same melody, right? So the rhythm has to do with the timing and the delivery. Some questions you might ask to figure out a rhythm include, on what beats are the notes hit? Meaning like, when do we deliver the notes? Does it start right on the 1? Is it like on the and of 1? Do we start on the 2? On what beat are we delivering this melody? You could also say that an element of rhythm is note length. Like remember when I said, bup, 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 bup? Those are now very short notes, which changes how we perceive that melody from Star Wars. It feels maybe like a little bit tighter or something. I don't know how you want to describe it, but note length is an element of rhythm. Another element of rhythm is accent. Accent is when you stress a beat or syllable. For example, if you want to represent the right and left hands when playing drums with R and L, you can write down different patterns. So here we have RL, RL. So you're starting with your right and then you're hitting your left hand next. If we were to start to like put different accents on these different beats, it's going to change how it feels. Here's an example of putting an accent every third beat. So what we're going to feel is the first right is accented, the second left is accented, and then we're just going to repeat this pattern indefinitely. So we're going to have an alternating accent. And this is what it sounds like. I'm just going to play it on my knees right now. So what we did there is we alternated accents between our right and left hands. If we did right-left with no accents, it might sound like this. It's kind of just like this boring straight rhythm, right? But once you start to add accents, it becomes interesting. It becomes like a cool pattern. All right, great. Moving forward. So next we have displacement. What is displacement? Let's just say displacement is shifting notes to different beats. You can move around a melody and decide, is it going to play on the 1? Is it going to play on the 2? Should the melody start on the 3? And where you choose to deliver the melody is what's going to make it really interesting. Some songs really come together in a cool way because none of the melodies like overlap. You don't want everything hitting on the same beat and hitting your audience member like right over the top of the head every time. You kind of want to shift things around and give them space. That way it's easier to mix. If you're interested in this stuff, I suggest you study reggae because I feel like reggae is a great example of like interlocking rhythms. The chuck might be on the upbeat, the snare is on the 3. Where things fit in the mix is really important. And it's a genre where it's a genre where there's a prescribed way to do things. You have the chuck on the upbeat like 99% of the time. All right, I hope that helps so far. The next thing that we need to do to understand swing, we need to understand how to count. And the counts that we're focusing on are quarter notes, eighth notes, and 16th notes. Quarter notes are really easy to count. They're just the integers. 1, 2, 3, 4. The next thing that we want to do is subdivide this rhythm. So to subdivide this, we're going to divide all of these notes in half in order to derive eighth notes. Here are the rhythmic subdivisions we care about today. We have quarter notes, we have eighth notes, and we have 16th notes. We count these by saying 1 eanda, 2 eanda, 3 eanda, 4 eanda. There are 4 beats per beat, and there are 4 beats total. So 4 by 4 is 16. 1 eanda times 4. For this example, let's look at eighth note swing. Eighth note swing is when you delay all the ands. We're going to look at an example right now in Ableton. When we say delay all the ands, that means like displace all the ands. We're shifting them back a little bit. What happens if we move them forward? Maybe we can look at that in a different video. Also for this tutorial, we have to understand what is a tuplet. A tuplet is a grouping of notes. Let's focus on the odd groupings. Things like triplets, quintuplets, septuplets, and nonuplets. Nonuplets, if you're not familiar with that, that means like 9s. You know, like if a mother gives birth to 9 babies, she has given birth to nonuplets. Septuplets is 7s, quintuplets is 5s, and triplets is 3s. We don't really care about the even groupings. The reason is that anything that's divided by 2 or 4 is usually just 4/4 time. Nobody says that groupings of 4 notes are called quadruplets. I've never heard that before, so just kind of like avoid that. Another thing you might say is like, well, what about 6/4 time, or like, what about like 12/4? Since 6 and 12 can both be divided by 3, we usually just think about these as triplets. 6s are double time triplets. 12s, I guess, are quadruple time triplets. 3 notes nested in 1/4 note. You might hear the term nested with this, meaning like they're within a grouping of, if that makes sense. And so using these odd groupings, triplets, quintuplets, septuplets, and nonuplets, let's use these to derive our swing percentages. All right, great, moving forward. So that's all the theory behind this. Why don't we look at an example? I'm gonna load up a drum rack on an open MIDI track to try and create these examples. I'm just gonna be using my keyboard, and I'm gonna dial in a quick kick snare pattern. All right, so let's move forward with our example. You can hear we have a kick snare pattern in the background, and what I'm gonna be doing is programming beats in this drum rack down here. You can actually just click in the notes, and that way you don't have to play them in real time. Let's start with a basic quarter note pattern. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. Next thing we want to do is create an 8th note pattern. So what we're going to do is subdivide that, right? We're going to start to add these ands in between the quarters. We need one rhythmic subdivision. We need to divide this in half. 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and then lastly for 16th notes, we just fill in the gaps. Copy paste. It's really robotic, right? It's super stiff. You're not getting out of your seat to dance. So the next thing that we're going to create here is we're going to create dotted triplets. Each of these clicks is a quarter note, right? And if I extend this over, it now becomes a half note. So what I'm going to do is create a bunch of half notes, select them all, and grab this marker up here. That allows me to drag these back. And you can now see that 3 notes occupy this space. We have triplets within 1/4 note. That's what I meant before about nested tuplets. Here we have triplets. In order to make them dotted, we're just going to remove the middle one. Okay? And this is very swung. I'm going to turn these off by pressing 0. It omits the notes. And we're going to do the same thing to create quintuplets. Put in 6 notes, move them forward. Now we have 5 notes in the space of 1/4 note. In order to make it swung quintuplets, what we're going to do is turn off 2 and then turn off the last one. This is swung quintuplets. Now let's do the same thing for septuplets. We're going to put down 8 notes and then drag them back. You get it? We have 7 in the space of 1. We're going to turn off these 3 here, and we're going to turn off the last 2. And then duplicate. This is how swung septuplets feels. Finally, let's do swung nonuplets. Put down 10 notes, select them all, grab the marker, drag it back, delete this one here. Now we have 9 notes in the space of 1. So what we did here is we left the first one on, and then we left the 6th one on. This is what swung nonuplets feels like. So I put the straight notes back in here. What you'll see is that the downbeat and the ands are dead on the line, right? They're right on the grid. With the triplets, on the other hand, they're pretty swung. This and that should be right here is displaced a little bit back. The same thing goes with the quintuplet rhythm. This is now displaced a little bit back, but not as displaced as the dotted triplet. The septuplet as well is displaced a little bit back beyond the straight note, but it's not as displaced as the quintuplet and not as displaced as the dotted triplet. And the nonuplet is just a little bit more straight than the septuplet. I hope that that makes sense to you here. Like, this is really powerful, I think, visually to understand what swing is. So now how do we use this to derive our swing percentages? Well, let's take out a calculator. What we're going to do is determine how far along the timeline this and is, meaning like how far back is it displaced. And there's just an easy way to figure it out. These dotted triplets here, since these first 2 notes take up 2/3 of this space and the last one takes up 1/3 of the space, we have a 2/3. You might think about this as like a 2 against 3 polyrhythm. The first note is on the downbeat. The second hit is 2/3 of the way in between the downbeats. All of these hits here would be downbeats, right? We have 1, 2, 3, 4. This strike here falls 2/3 of the way in between those downbeats. So 2 divided by 3 gives us a swing percentage of 67%. And that's what we call a dotted triplet. Next, we have quintuplets. Remember that we said swing is a pulse that is divided unequally. If we were to divide the pulse equally, that would be straight. This is 50%. This is like right down the middle. How far in between these downbeat strikes is this next quintuplet strike? Where does this and fall on the timeline? Well, these 3 notes take up 3/5 of the space, and these 2 notes take up 2/5 of the space. That means a quintuplet is 3 against 5. So we have 60% swing. We call these swung quintuplets. Next, we have septuplets. And I hope that you see that there's a pattern here, right? Like this and is a little bit displaced. It's a little bit delayed. How far delayed is it? You can see that this first strike takes up 4/7 of the space and takes up 3/7 of the space. So it's kind of like a 4 against 7 polyrhythm. We have 4 divided by 7. The even numbered strikes, meaning like the ands in the beat, fall 57% of the way in between the downbeats. And we call these swung septuplets. Lastly, we have nonuplets. Where does this and strike fall in between these downbeats? Well, it falls 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 5/9 of the way in between the downbeats. Does that now make sense to you? And if you look at this like a pattern, right? Each of these first numbers is increasing by 1, and each of these second numbers is increasing but going to the next odd digit. 5/9, if we consult our calculator, is about 55% swing. We call these swung nonuplets. Now you might be thinking like, well, what's next? I can just keep going with this pattern, right? The next integer would be 6, and then after that, the next odd integer would be 11. So what would the swing percentage be here? 6 divided by 11 is 54.5% swing. These would be called swung elevensies. If you're a Lord of the Rings fan, I hope that you appreciate that. Now the problem is, right, you might just be like, well, that's like so close. Like who can really hear the difference? And the answer is basically nobody. That's why we don't keep going. Because the more that we keep subdividing these tuplets, it just makes it more and more straight. Does that make sense? Well, why can't you go higher than like a dotted triplet? What happens if you place the and strike 75% of the way between the downbeat strikes? You get 3 divided by 4, right? And that would be 75%. The problem is this is back to 4/4 time. And then we have 1 eanda again. It's a 4/4 time subdivision. So we think about that as the Think about a kick that has a heartbeat pulse we might think of as a 1, a 2, a 3, a 4. That's an example of 75% swing, but we don't really think about that as swung. We just think about that as like another 4/4 time division. Technically these are 16th notes, right? So what do you think about this stuff? Does this make sense to you? I can do a follow-up tutorial if I didn't explain it very well, but I find this stuff really fascinating, you know? And personally, I really like things that are subtly swung. Like I'm not as big a fan of dotted triplets. They sound too much like old school jazz, like but quintuplets and septuplets and nonuplets, that's kind of where the subtlety is and where a lot of the groove is. Dudes messing with MPCs putting in like 60 or 57 or 55% swing. They were technically programming their beats to be quintuplets, septuplets, or nonuplets. It is the same thing. Now you don't have to count nonuplets in your head. Like when counting nonuplets, nobody's counting like 1, 6. The other crazy thing is, right? Look at your gear. If you have one of these Akai keyboards or an MPC or something, you can see the swing percentage numbers right on the keys. But it says swing 50%, swing 55, swing 57, swing 59, swing 61. So Akai here has swing 59 and swing 61. Those technically aren't quintuplets. It's almost like a quintuplet, but just shifted or displaced a little bit. So let me know what you think in the comments below. I always appreciate you watching. If you're not a subscriber, please subscribe now if you like this type of content. I also have a bunch of albums out. Please hit the link in description and take care.